So I do not remember my first sermon to my home church. I have no memory of it. I don't know what I preached about. I have a picture, though, of me, my mom. That's what moms do, took a picture. And I look at that picture, this young, no gray hair, energetic preacher, and it makes me feel old. I have that in my office, and it makes me feel old to look at that picture. And I have, since that time, preached, I can't count them, probably 1,000 or so sermons since then. I've been in ministry now coming close to 30 years, so that's 30 years of preaching sermons. Even on the preaching circuit when I was in seminary, when I was learning how to preach, and I've preached a lot of different places with different sizes of congregations, and I've preached in parks and wedding venues and preached all over the places. One place I remember specifically as I was on the preaching circuit in seminary was I preached at this small country church out in the fields of Texas, out in these fields, countryside, a small church. And I remember I preached to 5 people and a cat. And I think I converted the cat to be Presbyterian. I know that because the cat promptly went to the back row and fell asleep. That'd be pretty Presbyterian. So I have preached a lot of sermons, and I know, some of them have probably been pretty good. Some of them, more often than not, pretty so-so. And I know, God help me, I know there's been some awful ones. And I know that these sermons have gotten different kinds of responses from folks. Different kinds of responses. Some appreciative and affirmative. I've even had some sermons in which, people have kind of argued with me, which I've enjoyed. And I know I've had some sermons, people have left the building and don't ever want to come back again. But I have never, to this day, preached a sermon where the congregation wanted to kill me. That has never happened to me yet. Yes, thank you, Gary. And I read this text of Jesus preaching this sermon, and it ticks them off. It is so offensive to them that they want to kill him. And it makes me wonder, all these years I've preached, and I've never been as offensive as Jesus is. And maybe I'm preaching wrong. So what offended those people in that synagogue after Jesus read this scripture from the book of Isaiah and said, today the scripture is fulfilled? What ticked them off? So much that they were filled with rage and drove him out of the synagogue in town and put him they were going to throw him off the hill, off a cliff. What ticked them off? Well, essentially, they're at first happy with what Jesus, hey, isn't that Joseph's son? Isn't he great? They probably what happened at my own first sermon is afterwards, I have no memory of this, but they probably gave me a reception cake. That's what we Presbyterians do, right? Well, I imagine they were ready to give Jesus a reception cake. This is Joseph's son, isn't he doing great? And then Jesus makes a rookie mistake in preaching, is he doesn't stop at the high point. He starts telling these stories about these 2 prophets from their tradition. And he tells them a story of Elijah. It's part of their tradition, the stories that they would know. And that Elijah, he says, well, what happened was there was a great famine. The story goes there was a great famine in Israel. And God sent Elijah not to the Israelites, not to the Jews, but to this widow who's a Gentile, who's a non-Israelite. And then he compounds that by telling a story of Elisha. And when there was lots of lepers in Israel at the time of Elisha, there were lots of good Jews who had leprosy, but who does God send to heal of that leprosy? God sends Elisha not to the Israelites, the Jews. God sends to a Syrian, an enemy of the Jews. So what ticked them off? What did they find so offensive? Is God's grace. They were offended by God's grace. Now, in our tradition, much like I shared with the kids, grace is a central notion in our Reformed Presbyterian, above and beyond being on the back row, falling asleep. Above and beyond that, grace is essential to our understanding of who God is. This gift given to us unmerited, unearned, that we have received God's love not because we had right thinking or right beliefs. We have received God's love not because we acted correctly or rightly. It is simply a gift out of the abundance of God's love. We've done nothing to earn it. And it's scandalous. And in truth, other Christian traditions will actually be a little critical of us at times of our theology, which emphasizes grace so much, in part because they accuse us at times, and there might be some truth to this, that, where is our free will in this? If it's a gift, if it's an unending gift, if it's a relentless gift that will overcome all our barriers, where is our free will? And the answer for me, where our free will is, I do think it's possible to say no to God's grace. And you know why I think that's true? Because every single one of us here in these pews today, in this church, we say no to God's grace all the time. When we live our lives and live in fear and guilt and are unable to forgive ourselves, that's saying no to God's grace. When we're unable to see our self-worth, we're so hard on ourselves that we think ourselves less than we are supposed to be, that is saying no to grace. When we don't take a hold of this wild and precious life we've been given, that is saying no to grace. And we do it all the time. We find grace offensive. C.S. Lewis once had this line. He says, you know what? The gates of hell are locked from the inside. That we choose hell. And we do. And one of the ways in which we find grace offensive, one of the ways in which we say no to grace, is that more often than not, we're more comfortable with folks who think like us and look like us and believe the same things like us, that it's impossible to imagine that God extends grace and love to those very different from ourselves. And actually, we'd find it offensive that God extends love to those we would say are just wrong. It's offensive, God's grace. It offends our sensibilities that God's love goes to the MAGA hat-wearing person who wants to build up a wall as much as God's love and grace goes to that long-haired hippie who wants to tear it down. That's offensive. That God's love is willing to embrace the poor and the rich, white and black, yellow and brown. That God's love embraces the refugee as well as the citizen. Somehow, the radicalness of God's grace, this idea that God's love can extend to those we find so, let's be honest, offensive, makes us offended. Hard to imagine that kind of love in the world. And so we lock the gates of hell, build our walls, separate us from each other, because grace is offending us. Has anybody here heard of a preacher named Carlton Pearson? He was African-American preacher. He actually, when I lived in the Tulsa area, he lived there as well. He attended Oral Roberts University. He was a Pentecostal preacher. And Carlton Pearson attended Oral Roberts, a kind of conservative evangelical brand of Christianity. And he was mentored by Oral Roberts, and he founded, I believe it was a church called the Higher Dimensions Church, Higher Dimensions, and it actually grew. It was multi-generational, multiracial. It was a very growing Pentecostal church. In fact, became one of the largest in Tulsa. Ultimately became one of the largest in the country. And Carlton Pearson was becoming a famous preacher because he was on Trinity Broadcasting Network. Had a show, and he was invited to travel all over the country and preached all over, and was a much sought-after speaker and preacher. But Carlton Pearson was also undergoing this transformation in which he was reading Scripture, and he began to believe, in observing the world around him, he began to question an essential component of his tradition's faith. He began to wonder whether it was true that people who were non-Christians couldn't be saved. He began to wrestle with that from his own reading of Scripture. And he began to wonder as he was reading through the Scripture, he says, well, maybe there's not a literal hell, he'd said, but actually the very hells we create on this planet from our own human perversity and brokenness. And so he began to share this realization, this idea that God's love and grace is so much bigger than his tradition had ever imagined, and everything fell apart. People were offended. They left his church in droves. It got so bad that actually they had to foreclose on the church building. He was abandoned and declared a heretic by those in his tradition simply because he thought God's grace was bigger than we ever imagined. Now he preaches and teaches at a small church in Tulsa. People, this world finds grace offensive because it is. Because God's love is so much bigger than we ever imagined. So my prayer for you this week, two things, is that you notice, as you go out this week during the day, notice when you get offended by God's grace. Notice those moments when maybe you realize, well, God's love is big enough to forgive me or forgive someone else when I can't even imagine forgiving myself or someone else. There are moments when that'll strike you, when you'll be offended and you know you're going the right direction. And finally, my last request of you this week is I want you to be offensive. I want you to live such a grace that people are offended by you. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.